So we're back again with another of our DevOps Talks conference speakers. John, thanks so much for a great keynote this morning.
It was great, yeah, it was fun.
So tell me, what do you think about this conference?
It's good. I was invited last year, first time. It's a long haul for us to come over here, right?
Sure.
So I didn't know what to expect, but I thought, okay, trip to Australia, it was Melbourne. But I honestly, there was actually a lot of excitement and almost felt like where we were, me and you have been doing this a long time. I felt that the kind of like 3-4 year ago excitement.
Right.
And it was in the hallways and the questions you were getting were like the kind of questions we got 4 years ago. And in some of the community of people who were doing events, so it was an interesting mix. It was very much like where DevOps days was 3 or 4 years ago,
right,
with this like emergent excitement, as opposed to us getting jaded in a sense, right? But then there was also a fair amount of really bleeding edge technology stories. Mm-hmm. So you had this kind of constant circle of somebody who was doing something really interesting that you hadn't heard before. And the next conversation was somebody trying to get excited and wanting to understand how to tell their management how to do DevOps. So yeah. I loved it. And so when I was invited to get this year, I'm like, yeah, absolutely.
And the other thing that I think is really cool so far is that we've seen a good mix of technical and cultural talks, right? Yeah. So you were talking about DevSecOps, there was a serverless talk or Kubernetes talk, but then we just heard about the Westpac journey, and that was all culture-based.
Yeah, it's really, the same thing I was, as the pitches were rolling in the morning, my wife came with me and there was a woman, and this woman gave this diversity presentation last year when I was in Melbourne, and it was just, you wanted to cry at the end of it. It was so good.
Yeah.
And so he's done this conference has done a really good job of intermixing technology and culture in a way that it just flows evenly.
Absolutely. So we've got another day tomorrow. Any talks that you're looking forward to?
Lindsay Homewood, place in my heart. That dude, right. He's actually one of the original, weird shout out, but I was the only American at first DevOps Day. I went back and me and Damon started getting everybody excited about running DevOps Days in the US. The Stephen Nelson Smith and Ari went back to London and started creating, Chris Byatt created Europe and obviously Patrick. But Lindsay Homewood was the sole Australian and he started the DevOps Days movement in Australia at the same time. So he's kind of legendary in that fact, but don't miss his presentations. They are rivetingly interesting. So.
Absolutely.
And then you got one too, actually.
I do have one tomorrow.
The community stuff and why that's
absolutely
important in the enterprise. So I'm looking for those two. I'm going to catch.
All right, good. So before I let you go, just tell everyone where are you these days?
Okay, right now I'm working with a company called SJ Technologies. Really a lot of meta skills, transformation stuff. I know it sounds platitudish, but it's like all this stuff that we've learned over the last, say, 10 years. It seems like now for me, I'm actually able to put it in a bucket that actually is working.
Yeah.
And I'm getting to talk to CIOs, and we're literally able to decouple where you are on kind of a meta skill level, which is incredibly important. Like the tools, we know, but how your organization deals, the organization culture, but your meta skills in terms of organizational learning, organization, that kind of stuff. So that's been incredibly fun. So SJ Technologies, I'm always Botchkaloop on Twitter, everywhere. So easy to find.
Great, thanks, John.
Thanks, man.
All right.
So today I'd like to talk a bit about measurements and how we measure things in DevRel to improve our team's performance and drive growth, drive learnings, and make things better. And that's kind of what DevOps is all about. It's about improving things and making things better. So it's kind of a cliche statement, but I'll start with what gets measured gets done. It's all about measuring things and making sure we're measuring the right things to improve outcomes for the business and what we're trying to do in our high-performing teams. So just to introduce myself, my name is Ben. I work at MessageMedia, and I'm the engineering manager there, so I look after a number of development teams, and also head up our developer relations program, so making sure that developers out there understand how best to use our platform and how they can get the most out of it. If you haven't heard of MessageMedia, we are an API-first business messaging company, so we provide an API that allows developers to connect their applications to our platform to send and receive messages. So if you think about things like two-factor authentication messages, appointment reminders, rostering messages, sort of anything where you as a developer or owner of a system wants to communicate with your customers, you can connect to our API and send and receive messages to do that. I like my role in that I'm sort of in the middle, so I work really closely with the devs to understand what they're building and what we're offering to our customers, but also working with our external development communities to help them understand and best get what they need out of our platform. We've sort of been enjoying a really positive and transformational DevOps journey over the last 4 or 5 years. And at the point now where we've got around 11 or 12 different sort of DevOps squads, we call them, across Australia, Sydney, and Vietnam and Auckland. And each of those squads works together on a small part of the system that overall comes together and combines to create the platform that we can offer our services to our customers. So we've learned quite along the way. We're still learning as we're going, and that's kind of what it's all about, really, learning and experimentation. But we've seen a really big transformation in how these teams and squads sort of operate and work together as independent self-managing groups. Amongst that bigger platform, we all sort of come together and build something that has and provides a lot of value to our customers. So I'm going to jump back a sec and talk about sort of DevOps principles that get me excited and sort of what I sort of drive our teams to aspire towards and use in their day-to-day jobs. And a lot of this comes from the DevOps Handbook, which is a great read, and I really highly recommend it. I think it's been mentioned a couple of times at this talk already, but it's a really good read in terms of understanding the principles and fundamentals of how to sort of drive DevOps in your organisation. And those 3 principles talk about flow, so increasing how you can move value down that stream to your customer as quickly as possible. Feedback, so shortening and amplifying the feedback loops within your processes, within your teams, within what you're doing within your organisation. And a big part of the measurement is that feedback, getting fast feedback about how things are going. And learning and experimentation. So not just within our code bases and what we're delivering, but learning and experimenting with how we deliver and how our software teams work together to deliver software down that pipeline to our customers. So the measurements that I'll talk about are sort of really inspired and driven by the feedback. So getting feedback around when we make changes to our processes, and then being comfortable and knowing that we can make changes and learn and experiment and look at those measurements and see if they had a positive impact or if they had a negative impact, how can we change them to make that better. With the measurements I'm going to talk about, and the sort of the 4 listed up there that I'll go into detail on, what I like to do with that is roll all that information up and to create sort of dashboards around how we can track how the teams are going. And that's not to compare the teams. We don't want to compare one team against another and say you guys aren't performing versus the other team that is performing. It's more about to help us best direct resources and technical sort of fixes and changes to the teams that aren't doing so well in certain areas, and to take learnings from teams that are doing well in specific areas and help them apply those learnings to the way that other teams are working. So it gives us a nice overview. It gives us a really good way and a powerful way to talk to management and executive teams and say, we need to spend a little bit of time, or maybe a lot of time, focusing on this area of that team because they're really struggling with what they're doing and it's really holding up them trying to deliver value to the business. So with all of those metrics, or the metrics that I'm going to talk about and the measurements, we like to create these dashboards and then share them at sort of monthly meetings with the execs and say, here's how the teams are going, here's what we're doing to improve the red areas, here's why certain areas are yellow. And some of the things that we've done in the past have gotten those teams to the point where they've got sort of green dots on their dashboard. So, and some of these were covered off quite well in Nathan's talk this morning at a higher level. I'm going to dig down another level and talk about some of the specifics of how we measure them and why we measure them in the ways that we do. So the 4 things I'll talk about today are measuring deployments and how we're actually shipping code out to customers. Measuring the change lead time, so how long does it take again from that first commit of code through to that running in production. Measuring the health of our code bases. So I see the health of code bases as sometimes being an impediment to actually delivering that change lead time and reducing that and also getting more deployments out the door. And also service health, so taking that Codebase Health up one level to sort of a service type measurement and measuring the health of our services. Again, unhealthy services are typically likely to hold us back from delivering quickly, safely, and with confidence. So the first measurement, deployments. So we all hear about companies who are deploying, tens of thousands of deployments per day, making all these changes through to production. But I like to measure that, for us at least, on deployments per engineer. So not just that holistic number, that absolute number, but how many deployments is each engineer doing? How well does our deployment pipeline and our processes scale? Because as we add more engineers to our teams, we'd expect deployments to go up. But if it's not, there might be something wrong with the scalability of how we can deploy things. So we need to look into that area. It's not just measuring absolute deployments, but how many deployments are we doing overall as a team on average? Again, something Nathan touched on this morning, deployment duration. So if there are deployments that take a long time, that's typically going to introduce manual steps, wait times, steps that in that deployment that might be cumbersome or troublesome. So I like to measure how long each deployment takes so that we can track the average time for our deployments, or average duration, and look to make sure that deployments that are taking longer are addressed, and we're trying to improve the processes where those deployments are taking a long time. We do have manual deployments. We're not perfect. We're not where we want to be with automated deployments across the board. So we like to track the duration and make sure that we are trying to address that and bring that down by actually digging into those problems and seeing why the duration is so much higher than others. Another interesting one, which I haven't really heard of before, but something that came up when measuring and collecting all this data, was measuring the time of day for a specific deployment. So we're located in Australia, in Melbourne, and most of our deployments are done between business hours in Australian time. But when I started measuring the data, I found that our teams would only deploy things sort of in the afternoon. And I was kind of like, you come into work, what do you do for the first half of the day? Why aren't we pushing code out all the time? And their response was that in the morning, our systems are under highest load. That's when most of our customers are sending the majority of their messages. So the teams would steer away from deploying in the mornings and deploy things in the afternoon because of that fear of impacting that customer load and being a little bit frightened of deploying things when there's a lot of traffic going through the system. So it was interesting to find that that was the case, and then we can sort of dig into that and find out why we're scared of deploying when there's load on the system. Shouldn't we be confident in our tools and processes? And if we're not, let's address that. Finally, also measuring deployment success and failure. So that leads into working out what your change failure rate is, or as the Westpac guys said yesterday, the change success rate, which is a more positive way of looking at it, which I like to measure as well. So with all that data, we can put together some nice visualizations like what we've got on the screen up there. So on the left, I'd like to plot out the deployments that we do, the bubble showing the actual duration of the deployment, so big bubbles are bad, red bubbles showing failed deployments versus green for successful deployments, plotting the time of the deployment on the horizontal scale, and then the actual days of the week, or the time axis on the vertical scale. And that allows us to see what's happening with our deployments, how long are they taking, where are the failures, and where are they clustering, or where are there any issues that we want to address. Another one that I didn't speak about earlier, but looking at who's doing the deployments. So again, not to award the deployer, the engineer with the most deployments, some sort of award at the end of the day, but to make sure that everyone's doing deployments, everyone's getting involved in pushing code out to production, and we haven't got a certain person who's been lumped with all the deployments because everyone else is too scared to do it or doesn't know how to do it. So on the right-hand side graph, I want to see a nice sort of even distribution across the whole team so that everyone is getting involved with deployments, everyone's comfortable doing it, and we haven't got any single point or single person dependencies or issues there. To actually collect all of this data, what I do is quite rudimentary, but in Jira, I literally just get a webhook and push that to an API gateway, chuck all that data into a database. That gives me time of day, duration, who did the deployment, and also whether it's a success or a failure. So I've got a column on our Jira board, which is just deploying. Pushing that data to this database gives me all this data I need to roll it up and actually collect these metrics. It's not perfect, but there's some automation there which takes the hassle out of collecting this data every day or every week for these reports. And it allows us to feed this information back to the team so they know how they're going and how they're performing and what's happening with the way they're working. The next part that I like to measure, and this is sort of a really important one, is the change lead time. So how long does it take for us to, once we've started writing code or committed the first bit of code to a repository, through to when it's running in production? And then taking that all down a level, I like to look at the time spent in each step. So again, on our Jira boards, we've got all these different steps, writing code, peer review, system test, manual test, deploying, all of those different steps. I like to measure the time that we spend in each of those steps for every story. And again, it's not to pick on people whose story is taking a bit longer than someone else's, but it just allows us to produce trends and gather data and information around how different teams are doing their work. And then we can look at stories that are going really outside the bounds and start to call those stories out and say, are the requirements really clear for that story? Has things been broken down enough? And it allows the teams to gauge how they're going as well and sort of spot those outliers that might be affecting performance and delivery. Another measure that I like is, and it's probably more important than the time spent in each step, is the wait time between each step. So we've got the columns that, waiting for deployment, waiting for QA. How long are the stories or the work sitting in those columns waiting for someone to do something with? There's a good graph which I'll show in a couple of slides' time which talks about wait time versus percentage resource busy. So the busier your teams are, and the more things that are sitting in wait, the longer and longer it's going to take for you to get that code and that working value delivered out to production. So measuring the wait time I find is really important as well. And it can be quite a bit scary to measure how long things are actually sitting around waiting with no one actually actioning it. And then finally, something that I'm really keen on is looking at the pull request metrics. So we talk about the feedback loops and bringing feedback towards the left of our delivery life cycles. Pull requests are a great way of picking up errors and bugs before the code is even committed to master branch or develop branch. And I've found in certain occasions that there are pull requests that sort of go a bit haywire. They're big, long pull requests. There's hundreds of comments on them when probably could have just sat down and had a conversation with people in the room. And the pull request might be open for days or weeks, which is a little bit scary for me. I like to get things moving as quickly as possible. So along with measuring the time spent in each column and the time spent waiting for people to pick up work, I also like to measure the pull request and actually what's the size of the pull request, how many comments are on it, how long was it taken until it got to be closed, and how many people were involved in reviewing it. Just so we can look at, again, outliers in those areas and call those tickets out and say, team, this isn't going too well, what can we do about this ticket to get it moving along? Again, rolling all that stuff up into simple visualizations like what we've got here. So calling out the average change lead time across all of the teams, which teams are below that, which teams are above that average change lead time. Making sure that they're breaking down the stories and the pieces of work into as small as possible pieces so that they can flow through the board as quickly as possible and out into production. Looking at the average wait time, so how long in that 35 hours is the ticket just sitting there waiting for someone to work on it? How do we reduce that wait time? Also looking at the average time it takes for a PR to close. So making sure that, again, we're breaking down our work into small easy to deal with tasks and making sure that our PRs aren't sticking around for ages. Graphing that on the left-hand side so that we can see when we make changes to our processes, when we remove some pull request sort of reviewers or make things faster, do they have a faster or improved or decreased impact on actually getting code or working value out to production for our customers? When we add more people to the team, does it actually speed things up or does it slow things down? Should we have two separate teams rather than one big team? So measuring all of those things over time allows us to see how those changes that we're doing and what would the changes that we're making to our teams, how does it affect delivery? Does it make things worse or does it make things better? And then actually have actual data to back that up. Cool. So touching on that wait time versus resource busy, another book plug. There seems to be a few at this conference over the last couple of days, but the Phoenix project, which the Westpac guys talked about yesterday as well, talks about wait time versus percentage resource busy. So what this graph says is that as your resources get more and more busy, up into the 90, 100% mark, the wait time for the work that's been done by that team increases exponentially. So I found this with a few of my teams where there was just stories sitting in columns for weeks or months that weren't being worked on. And it kind of said to me that we need to actually slow the team down. So take things off the board, take things off their plate, which is a bit scary at first. You're removing work, you're trying to slow the team down to make them go faster. But once you remove or decrease that time that they're busy, they're actually able to jump onto those tasks that have been sitting around waiting. It allows higher throughput across all of the stories that you're working on. So optimizing for the whole process, not just for certain individual parts of it, to actually get things moving through the system quicker. Another really good read, recommend having a look at that just to understand sort of that Kanban mentality and how to get things moving faster across the whole board and not just certain areas that you're throwing resources at. Stepping down to sort of the application level land, over our time I've found that unhealthy code bases or code bases that have been neglected actually serve to really hurt and slow down delivery. So I like to measure a number of different things across our code bases to make sure that we're applying the appropriate efforts to get them up to the standard that we expect and the standards where we don't see that impacting delivery too much. So the first one is measuring the age of dependent libraries or dependencies that we have within our code bases. So we're always pulling down all these other libraries that we depend on, making sure that those dependencies aren't getting too old. Because I always found that when we have these dependencies that get really out of date and it comes time to update them because they have a bug or a vulnerability or there's an issue with them or we want to use a new feature and they're years and years out of date, it's a really big, difficult task to update them to the latest version. So making sure that we're continuously updating our libraries and dependencies with those small incremental increases, which are nice and easy, as opposed to one big upgrade every 2 years or so. Similarly, looking at the age of vulnerabilities in those libraries as well. So let's say if we put a 6-month threshold on that first metric that we want to measure, libraries with vulnerabilities in them, we might bring that metric into 1 month and say that we're not going to accept anything with a vulnerability in it for 1 month. It's really up to you in terms of what you choose for that, but just making sure that you're measuring that and tracking those numbers and calling out and saying we need to spend time upgrading this library that we're using because there's something wrong with it and it's going to cause an issue for us. Thirdly, in terms of the code base area, measuring complexity, duplication, test coverage, etc., etc. So using tools like SonarQube to sort of analyze and continuously inspect the Codebase Health, which those types of tools give you nice, really good coverage of how things are looking across the whole code base. And then that sort of gets rolled up into a rating, say an A to an F or an A to a D rating, which you can then use to assess the code bases that you have running in your system and make sure that you're applying the appropriate time and effort to getting those up to the right level to ensure that those code bases don't rot, they don't fall into disrepair and cause issues when you actually go to make changes to it and deploy it through to production. So visualizing that, on the left-hand side, I like to produce sort of bar graphs showing how out of date our libraries are getting and calling out ones that fall outside a certain range. So the team can say to me, hey Ben, we need to spend a bit of time upgrading this library because it's over 6 months old now. It's got issues with it, it's causing production problems, or we just want to actually use new features in it. If they come to me and say that without sort of any justification, I'll be like, no, let's just work on products, let's get new features out. But if we can sort of measure it and say, look, we're not going to accept anything older than 6 months, for example, we can spend time and effort on that because that's actually visible on our dashboards. Also looking at the different repositories and how they're rated in terms of the quality of that code and how it's been looked after, that really easily calls out code bases that are falling into disrepair and allows us to spend time and effort fixing those. And then with all of that, across all the repositories and all the code bases we have, we can sort of roll that up into high-level metrics to measure how we're tracking across the board. Are things improving or are things getting worse? Are we're putting too much effort into products and features and we're not spending enough time keeping things in check? Or are we actually spending perhaps too much time keeping our code in check and not enough time or not pushing hard enough to get new features and services out to customers? Going up a level, so we've got our code bases which make up might have a number of different code bases which make up a service. A service might have a few data stores, have a few load balancers to sort of create some sort of service that we deliver to customers. Measuring the health of a service. So this is a bit more of an audit type activity, I see it as, for us anyway. But measuring the data stores and communications channels within a service. Are we encrypting all the data at rest? Is the data that's been transferred across the wire encrypted as well? Are we using HTTPS between all those services? Measuring those as sort of a yes-no type weighted rating scale. Looking at the deployability of that service as well. So can we do an A/B type deployment for this service? How long does the deployment typically take? And is there any interruption to service for that deployment or for that service when we deploy it? How well have we engineered our deployment pipeline for this service so that we can make sure that, again, we can deliver changes to it, get it out to the customers and get that value out as quickly as possible. We also have a number of architectural principles that we hold quite dearly, but they not always, but they often get compromised with delivery deadlines and other constraints that are put on us as a tech team. So how well does each of these services align with those architectural principles? We have them listed out and we can measure those and sort of give a yes-no answer. Does it do this? Does it do that? To actually measure how healthy or how well this service has been architected. And again, we do have to make compromises. We're all kind of familiar with that. But at least by measuring it and calling it out, as a team we can say, look, we got this service out to production 2 months faster. We did make these compromises and here now we're calling it out and saying that this service is a little bit unhealthy. And over the longer period of time, it's going to take us, perhaps 10% longer to deploy each time we make a change to this service, which over time is going to impact how we get value out to customers for that piece of service. Another one that I kind of find interesting is time since last deployment. So when we're not often making changes to a piece of software that's running in our stack somewhere, we find that a couple of months or a couple of years comes around and we have to make a change to it. Being able to push that change out to production for something that hasn't been deployed in months or years can actually be a little bit scary and quite cumbersome, because there's a whole lot of changes that have happened around that service since that last deployment, which sort of affect how we can get that change out to production. So measuring the time since last deployment and actually having that impact the rating of a service as well is quite interesting for me to track. Make sure that we are pushing changes out, even if it's just updating some libraries within that service or updating the service to use a newer deployment pipeline, so that we're confident that we can push that change out to production as quickly as possible. So for the service health, I sort of put together what we call a scorecard, and it's weighted against a whole lot of attributes that we measure and care about. So some examples up there, is the data encrypted at rest? Is the service stateless? As is there data stored within the service that it means we can't do an A/B type deployment? And also, how long since the last deployment? Using those metrics or attributes with a weighting scale gives us an overall score for each service, which we can then roll up into a rating, I guess, of A, B, C, or D. So that lends the teams the ability to say, hey Ben, we took those shortcuts a couple of months ago to get that service finished quicker and deployed out to production. That means that service is really only rated a C. We want to make these changes to encrypt the data, add HTTPS. We want to make it stateless by taking the data out of that and putting it into a separate data store. Otherwise, deploying this service ongoing and maintaining it is actually going to be hurting us as a team and causing us discomfort and slowing us down. And I can sort of look at the score of that service and say, yeah, look, you guys are right. You're making a good point to what you're saying, and let's invest the time in that service to bring it up to the point where we want to see it as a B or an A. And when they do make those changes, we can reassess and reevaluate, remeasure these things, and make sure that the changes they are making are actually improving our overall tech platform. Across all of our services, we can sort of average all that out and give us an overall service health score, which allows us to again track how our whole sort of infrastructure is going and how does it look, and how do we see it and perceive it. There are some other things which I won't go into detail because it's almost lunchtime. But other things to measure as well that are quite interesting for me is looking at not just the vulnerabilities, the dependencies, the age of the dependencies in our software, but the age of software systems that we depend on as well. So looking at the age of database engines, our Puppet version, our Kong version, for example, to make sure that we're also keeping those systems up to date and they're not falling out of age. Platform utilization, so making sure that we're actually making the best use of our platform resources, making sure that we're not wasting capacity, and making sure that the changes we do make that are intended to improve that utilization are actually having the intended effects. Also, operational alerts per service. So we don't want to get rid of all operational alerts because they help us point out when there's problems, but making sure that when there are noisy alerts, we're getting rid of those. And when there are alerts that don't mean anything, we actually get rid of those or change or fix the problem that's actually causing that alert rather than just having them hang around. And then finally, maybe the most important one is measuring the team health. There's probably a whole talk that can go into measuring team health, but making sure that the actual team is happy, enjoying what they're doing, understanding what they're doing, and actually wanting to come to work every day. That's probably the most important one to measure. Won't touch it here. I'm sure there's plenty of ways that you guys are all measuring the health of your teams, but that one's a really big one as well. So just to recap, the 4 things that I find really important to measure and help drive DevOps improvements and sort of DevOpsing our DevOps by measuring and getting feedback, not on what we're building, but also the way we're building it, is looking at deployments. So measuring deployments per engineer, making sure that our deployment practices are scaling as our team grows. Measuring deployment duration, making sure that those manual, cumbersome deployments are getting sort of engineered out of our system. Measuring the time of day for deployments, finding any weird obscurities that the teams might be practicing for certain reasons that are unbeknown to you just yet. And then success and failure to give you that change success rate. Measuring the change lead time, so code goes into a repository, how long does it take to get to production and how can you reduce that? Wait time, so making sure that your resources aren't overworked and they're actually getting through the work in a nice, consistent, efficient fashion. And And then looking at the pull requests as well. So what information can you pull out of all that data that's sitting in not the code, but in the pull requests around the code? Measuring the Codebase health. So how healthy are your code bases? Unhealthy code bases are typically going to have a negative impact on the first two metrics that you're measuring there. And similarly, how healthy are the services that you're operating within your platform or infrastructure as well? Again, unhealthy services are probably going to negatively impact the first two measurements that we've got up on screen. I'm going to let you all get out to lunch now. If anyone wants to continue the conversation or has any metrics that they're really excited about or they want to share, please get in touch or come have a chat outside. And thank you all for your time this afternoon.